In the aftermath of Bantry Bay, the British government decided that the only policy was to strike terror into the hearts of the Irish people. And so between 1797 and 1798, you see incredibly repressive acts across the countryside, tortures, whippings, all kinds of punishments being used to just make sure that the Irish would hand over their weapons, remain loyal, keep their heads down in the event of any conflict. Increased repression. And also you see a terror in Ireland amongst the Irish loyalists. Because what they learned from Bantry Bay was that they could not rely on the Royal Navy for protection. The Royal Navy had not stopped a French invasion force from coming so near to landing in Ireland. And so they would have to take matters into their own hands. So even though the policy that was approved was to strike terror, the kind of terror that was unleashed in Ireland in 1797 and 1798 went far beyond what even the British government might have imagined. And I suppose there's two interpretations when you look at this terror. One is to say that it actually encouraged more people to rise up in 1798. That in a way the terror and the brutality that was inflicted on the Irish people made rebels out of people who might otherwise have remained loyal, and there's certainly evidence for that. A second interpretation is that maybe it succeeded to a certain extent, and that the reason why 1798 was limited to only certain parts of the country was because the government had done their job. Edward Cook, the Castle Under-Secretary, certainly inclined to that second interpretation. He said in 1798 at the start of the year, "If we treat rebellion as rebellion, we are safe." In other words, they felt that once you get them out into the open, once you treat them as if they're already in open conflict, well then that's the only way of ensuring a victory. But just to read some of the accounts, and some of the accounts even from the loyalists is really quite revealing. John Gifford, his nickname was the dog in office because he was such a loyalist. Well, he was on duty with his regiment called the Ancient Britons, and they were searching for arms in Newry in 1797. And he said that, he later wrote, "I was directed by the smoke and flames of burning houses, and by the dead bodies of boys and old men slain by the Ancient Britons, though no opposition whatever had been given by them. And as I shall swear to Almighty God, I believe not a single gun was fired, except by Britons and yeomanry. I declare that there was nothing to fire at, old men, women and children excepted. From 10 to 20 were killed outright, many wounded, and 8 houses burned." So that was a loyalist writing afterwards, saying that this was an atrocity, this was a war crime, and house burnings became a speciality in this period. One captain, a man called Thomas Bacon, ended up getting the nickname Burning Bacon because he would burn people's houses and then he would throw the inhabitants of the house back into the burning building, and he didn't care if they burnt up. John McCracken, whose brother Henry Joy McCracken was in prison, he said that the barbarities committed on the innocent country people by the yeomen and Orangemen are horrific. The practice is to hang a man up by the heels with a rope, full of twist, by which means the sufferer whirls around like a bird roasting at the fire, during which he is lashed by belts, etc., to make him tell where he has concealed arms. There are instances of women being raped and then dying afterwards. And some of these reports even come from the own government militia units. You had examples of pitch capping. So it did have the effect of throwing the United Irishmen into disarray. It did have the result of capturing a lot of weapons. They also managed to succeed in capturing a lot of the leaders of the United Irishmen in this period. And the one thing that is consistent in Irish history throughout this entire period that we are looking at is the British reliance on spies and informers. The success of the British at being able to infiltrate these revolutionary units, or at being able to persuade people to switch sides and betray their colleagues for money. And that was certainly in evidence in 1798, because so many members were in the United Irishmen. It was estimated that maybe 250,000 of the Irish people were United Irishmen. And the trouble was, so many of them were either then captured and tortured for information, or bribed so that they would betray their fellow comrades. And so the British had a clear idea of what was going on. And there was a major raid on a house where the rebel leaders were meeting on the 12th of March 1798. And actually, one story about how the British find out about that shows just how inept some of these preparations were. Because earlier that day, there was 2 United Irishmen in a radical bookstore, and a British soldier in his red coat came in. And they went up to him and they thought, well, look, if he's in a radical bookstore, he must be a radical. And they said, excuse me, sir, are you a radical? And he said, yes, I am. And they said, well, we're having a meeting tonight. Why don't you come along? And he said, I think I will. Can I bring some friends? Oh, but more the merrier. Well, he did bring his friends. He brought his whole military unit to raid that building that night. And so many of the leaders of the United Irishmen were captured that night. And it meant that then the United Irishmen had to look to a second tier of leaders to lead the revolution in 1798 because of that surgical strike. And actually, one of the counties that rose up first was Wexford. And the reason why Wexford rose up is because when they raided that meeting on the 12th of March, they managed to get lists of all of the members in the different counties. And so they arrested so many of those members in the months ahead. But the delegate from Wexford did not turn up. And the story goes that he had stopped for a pint at a nearby tavern called the Bleeding Horse, which is still in Dublin. He stopped for a pint, stayed for a second, began chatting up a girl who was sitting beside him, and he ended up staying there talking to the girl and never made his way to the meeting. So when that was raided by the army, they got lists for all the counties, but not for Wexford. So the United Irishmen, their plans were in disarray. The country was in a state of terror, horrific treatment of regular civilians as the government tried to terrify the people into submission. The leader who wasn't captured on that raid was Lord Edward Fitzgerald, and so many of the hopes of the revolution were pinned on him because he, first of all, had military experience. He had been in the British Army. He had fought on the British side against the American colonists in the War of Independence. He had returned home. He was the son of one of the leading landowners in the country, the Duke of Leinster. And he was, I suppose, in modern day terms, the equivalent of a celebrity. Crowds of people would follow him in the streets just to get a glance of him. Daniel O'Connell, the future nationalist leader, said that he did the same in the 1790s, that he would run after Lord Edward just to get a look. Because he was young, he was handsome. He came back from France wearing a short hairstyle. Short, probably a bit like mine. And everyone who was sympathetic to the rebel side copied that hairstyle. They cropped their hair very short. And so the nickname that the British gave the rebels in 1798 was the Croppies, because of their cropped hairstyle, the hairstyle that they copied from Lord Edward Fitzgerald. And Lord Edward Fitzgerald had a glamorous wife, Sophie. It was rumoured that she was the illegitimate daughter of a French nobleman, a man who ended up becoming a future king of France. So he was even connected by marriage to glamorous French nobility. He was connected himself to the Dukes of Leinster, one of the great Irish landowning families. And it was said that his name could have led an army, could have raised an army of 250,000 people. Well, an arrest warrant went out for him in March 1798. He went on the run, but a spy betrayed him. An informer betrayed him in May 1798, and he was captured. And there was a shootout in Dublin, and he was shot, and he died. And his death was a massive blow, because his death cost the movement of this symbolic leader of it, the person who could not only lead them in the fighting on the field, but whose name would encourage them to rise up in rebellion. And that proved a massive blow. And the loss of Lord Edward Fitzgerald was a major blow for the rebellion. So the rebellion that did break out on the night of the 23rd of May was really very different from what the United Irishmen had wanted. They had really wanted risings in all parts of the country. But the government had been successful in their work. In some counties, the brutality had been so extreme, it had been so violent, that the people were cowed into submission. The surgical strike arresting the leaders had also been successful. The information that they had gathered from torture had been successful in also cutting out some of these areas. So The rebellion did not break out in all parts of the country. It only broke out in certain parts. And really you could almost see it as three pretty much separate revolutions. You see one in the south of Ireland, in the southeast, in Wexford and Wicklow. Then there was a second outbreak in Ulster. And then you see a third one in the west of Ireland. And by and large, the rest of the counties, including Dublin, remained quiet. And one of the great ironies is that it was the Presbyterians who rose up in Ulster, and that it was the Catholic militia who helped put them down. And afterwards, you see the Presbyterians turning their back on radicalism and revolution, and they became some of the key supporters of the Union. And afterwards, then, they became the bedrock of the Ulster Unionist movement then, and the entire Unionist movement then in the 19th and early 20th century, and indeed throughout the 20th century. Whereas in the rest of the country, the rebellion was largely being fought by Catholics, although many of them had Protestant leaders, and being attacked then by the Protestant loyalists and by the British Army. So when the rebellion broke out on the night of the 23rd of May, it was isolated to some of these areas. But the rebels in Wexford had some initial victories. They were able to defeat the British in some early encounters. They were led by some Protestant leaders like Beauchamp, Bagnall, Harvey, and they also had some of the Catholic priests joined in. Priests like Father John Murphy, and they were able to rally the people to it. But that also created some pressures, because afterwards then, when the accounts of the rebellion were written, this element was played up. And it alienated a lot of the Presbyterians in Ulster, because they thought, well, we were fighting for a non-religious vision of Ireland, and yet what the others were fighting for seems to have been very much a priest-led, religious influence thing. And that alienated many of them from it, especially because there were some sectarian atrocities on both sides. Now, up until now, I've mentioned the atrocities that were on the government side. There were also atrocities on the rebel side. There were two crucial atrocities that took place in Wexford in this period. The first one was at Scullabogue, when the rebels were repulsed after a battle. They ended up herding 100 Protestant prisoners into a barn, and that barn was set on fire, and those prisoners were burnt to death. And Scullabogue had a lasting memory in Irish history, because what it seems to suggest was that when this national rebellion broke out, that for many of the Catholics, they used it as an opportunity to get revenge on their fellow Irish people. That Tone's vision of Catholic, Protestant and dissenter being submerged into a common identity of Irishman, that they didn't think that really had happened. And then there was a second atrocity at Wexford Bridge when the rebels were repulsed trying to capture Wexford town. They piked 70 prisoners to death on Wexford Bridge. And those two atrocities had a lasting memory, in Protestant memory in Ireland, because it kind of brought back memories of 1641, of that uprising in October of that year, when it looked like the Catholics had risen up to murder the Protestants in their beds. And the spectre of 1641 was haunting the land in 1798. This fear again that the Catholics couldn't be trusted, that the Catholics would just degenerate fighting into brutal sectarian anti-Protestant violence, that began to haunt the land again. And Lord Clare, who was the Irish Lord Chancellor, he gave a speech in the Irish House of Lords in 1798, just before the outbreak of the rebellion, where he said, there is only one way to deal with these rebels. The only way is to take out the leaders and hang them all until they are dead. String them up by the rope and hang them until they're dead. And that became known as the rope speech. And it horrified many people at the time. But when the fighting did break out in May 1798, people began to look to that and say, well, maybe there was some wisdom in that. Maybe that's the only way you can treat these rebels. And the 1798 rebellion, as we'll see, became one of the most violent conflicts that ever took place on Irish soil. It is estimated that 30,000 people died during that conflict, and only 3,000 of those were government soldiers. So there were huge casualties on the rebel side. It was a huge defeat for the rebels. It became an inspiring moment for Irish nationalists in the years ahead. But for the Irish who had to live through it, it was one of the bloodiest periods of their history.